Welcome to the Better Selling Through Storytelling Method Mastermind. I'm honored that we have Mark Lovett here today, all the way from Lisbon. Mark and I knew each other when we lived in Southern California together, and he was running the TEDx for San Diego for many, many years, and then went on to do it down between the border of Mexico and California, and then even has done a TEDx in a prison. So he is the expert on not only TEDx, but how to tell a great story. Mark, thank you for joining us today.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here, John.
Let's have people know a little bit more about you. So would you mind expanding on your background just a tad?
Well, I like to tell people that I was a former corporate executive who was saved by storytelling.
Yes.
I spent many years in the computer industry in Southern California.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got out of that and started consulting, and it was one of my clients who actually started TEDx San Diego back in 2010.
Mm.
But that's a program that only started in 2009, so he was one of the first TEDx's right out of the gate. And then he drugged me into the process to be a co-organizer. And then, as the story goes, after one of the events, he put something in my wine. And I woke up the next day with the license to TEDx San Diego in my hand. So over a 6-year period, we produced 20 TEDx events.
Wow.
The big ones inside Symphony Hall were 1,800 people. You mentioned the one we did on the border where we built a stage in the United States and a stage in Mexico. And there was just the border fence right in the middle. And we alternated our speakers back and forth from one country to the other. And then for 2 years, we did TEDx inside prison, in a state prison. And then our last event was a youth event. And that's where all the speakers, all of the performers, and the MCs were all high school students. My only rule was no adults allowed on stage.
I bet the kids loved that.
Yeah, they did. They were thrilled. It's like, we don't have any teachers or principals. We can just we're going to run this thing.
How fun.
So yeah, that whole process got me into speaker coaching, which has been a wide variety of things, from seminars to one-on-one. You and I met through Speaker Adventure.
Yes.
Which was a program I put on with another amazing speaker coach. And we would just bring 6 people together for a weekend and do really intensive storytelling training.
Mm-hmm.
So storytelling's become a lot of fun, and it's the passion of my life.
What I find so interesting is many, many people will say to me, I don't have a story. And I don't have any interesting things to talk about. And you have shown that everyone from a high school student to someone in prison has a story. Can you speak to that a little bit of how can people who may not feel that they have a story, where should they start looking?
So that is a common comment that I get from people also. You know, I don't have a story to tell. I'm just an average person. I haven't done anything great.
Mm-hmm.
I said, wow, interesting. No story to tell. So you've never had any experiences in life. You've never made any mistakes. You've never had any successes. You've never learned a single lesson in your entire life. And they go, oh, no, let me tell you about, start rattling off. You know, they were a football star in high school, or they got in a car wreck and almost died, but they, obviously recovered from it. And when you dig into it, everyone does have a story. They have learned something. They have wisdom to share with other people. And once you can bring it out of them, then you get the ball rolling, and then they really get into storytelling mode.
Yes. I once heard someone say that your mess is your story. And so that sort of is a different way of looking at it, because you're saying you never made a mistake. You never had any experience where you learned a life lesson. And I think once we start to look at our lives, we think, well, there is a story. And then the other issue is Well, I'm not good at telling stories. So we've solved one problem. We've given people two
Right.
places to look in their life: mistakes you've made, lessons you've learned. Now, before anybody feels comfortable telling a story, even at a party, let alone in front of people for business purposes, um, they think, well, I kind of stumble through it. Um, so let's just talk about that, Mark. How much practice is required when someone does give a TEDx talk?
So let me back up a step just to the kind of overall point, and then we'll
Yes.
get into the TEDx.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, there's one of these, urban legends that gets out there that says, people fear public speaking more than death.
Yes.
So I used to teach a class at the University of California, San Diego in storytelling.
Mhm.
And everyone would nod their head like, yes, I've heard that. I believe that. That's the most frightening thing. I said, okay, I'm going to give you everyone in the class a choice.
Mm.
Option A is you come up in front of the class and you speak for 5 minutes. Option B, I have a guillotine out in the parking lot. And you can walk out to the parking lot and it's like off with your head. How many of you are going to choose to go out to the parking lot?
Funny.
Of course, nobody raises their hand.
Yeah.
And in that class, the first night, there are a lot of very nervous people.
Mm-hmm.
And by the 6th class, everyone is up there delivering stories and they're blowing away the other students. And they're all saying, I had no idea you were such a great speaker.
Ah.
So it's not that we're afraid of public speaking.
Yeah.
As humans, we are afraid of doing anything that we're
Mm.
not good at, and that we're
Yes.
going to do in public because
Ah.
we don't want to embarrass ourselves.
Got it.
But once
So,
you can start practicing, to your point, and get used to it, you realize, oh, wait a minute, I can actually do this. I tell
mm.
stories all the time. I still tell stories to my family. I tell stories to my friends. I tell stories at work all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Up on stage is a little different, but I can do it.
Well, that reminds me of a book I read called Scared Speechless.
Hmm.
And Steve, my friend Steve Rohr, wrote it. And he said, what's going on in our brain is that, from a tribal standpoint, stick with the herd.
Hmm.
And if you get,
Yes.
hurt or you're, limping behind, that's when you get picked off by a predator. And so our old brain is wired. If we're standing in front of an audience, the herd is out there. You're all by yourself. What are you doing? You're going to get hurt. And the other common thing I hear is that I get butterflies in my stomach. I get really
Right.
nervous and I hate that feeling. So I'm going to give everybody a solution to that really quick here, which is the goal is not to get rid of those butterflies in your stomach, but to get those butterflies in your stomach to fly in formation. Get the nervous energy out of your stomach and into the room. If we make a gesture, then we're putting energy into the room. It comes out of our stomach. But I think the biggest thing is get out of your head worrying about how you're doing. As you said, we're so afraid of embarrassing ourselves, being judged. Will they like me? Am I good enough? On and on and on.
Right.
So the key to getting those butterflies in your stomach is don't try to get rid of them. Get them to fly in formation. What are your thoughts on that?
No, I love that. And it's very common. A lot of times people think, oh, only the amateurs get butterflies in their stomach. I've talked to so many professionals. They've been on stage 1,000 times and they still have that nervous energy. And to your point, they kind of turn it around to use it to help them rather than, to detract from their
Yes.
giving a speech. And what I try to tell people is think about this before you're going on stage. The fact that you have this honor to connect with an audience and that you're going to give them a gift of your wisdom. This is a lesson you've learned, an idea that you have, an experience that you have, and you're going to share it. And that the audience is sitting there because they want to hear your story. And they're not passing judgment on you. Instead, they're actually showing love to you.
Oh.
And when I tell that to people, they kind of look at me really strange, like, what do you mean? These people don't even know me. How can they love me?
Mm-hmm.
And then they get out there and they give a talk and then they come off stage and they go, oh my God, you were right. I could feel the love coming out of the audience.
Yes.
I could see the smiles. I heard the laughter. I got the applause. and they start feeding on that energy. And once you can kind of bring the energy of the audience in, then the butterflies typically just kind of go away.
And what I found recently when I gave a virtual keynote, as opposed to doing it in front of an audience, we had that energy going back and forth, that I wasn't sure if the energy was going to come. I knew I could put the energy out, but I didn't know, because as right now, everyone's on mute. So I thought, I'm wondering if this is going to still be the impact that I'm looking for. And sure enough, it was. The element of connection and the joy of storytelling comes through virtually, which is fantastic to know. And of course, we can do Zoom breakout rooms, and we've got chats. We've got some questions here already. But before we jump into that question, let's just recap what we've covered so far. Everyone has a story. Look at your mistakes or lessons learned. Overcome your fear of giving the talk, because you want to get those butterflies in your stomach to fly in formation, get out of your head, worrying about embarrassing yourself. And then I think one of the key elements, so we don't feel like we're going to stumble, is practice. Would that be the next logical thing of, okay, I know what I'm going to say. I'm not so afraid of, having to be perfect even, but the practice part also supports getting those nerves to go away. Yes?
Exactly. Because the more comfortable you are, the more relaxed you're going to be on stage. We used to always talk about, when we did Speaker Adventure, there's this process of moving the talk from your head down to your heart.
Yes.
Because it's always in your head when you're trying to remember, what's my next line? What's the next thing I'm going to say? But once you rehearse it enough times, it starts to become easier and easier to recite. So it's what's often called the happy birthday effect. I'd walk up to anybody on the street and said, start singing happy birthday. They wouldn't stop and say, oh, wait a minute, what are the lyrics to that?
How does that go?
Yeah, they would just start singing happy birthday because they've done it so often. And so for me, there's this kind of circular process of writing, rehearsing, and editing. And I try to get students involved in that as soon as possible. And I'm a big proponent for writing out your talk, because the writing is where ideas really start to flow. And then stand up and just rehearse this talk. And all of a sudden you'll start hearing yourself going, oh, that sentence doesn't sound right. Or I would never say that word. Or this sounds just a bit disjointed.
Yes.
And one of the big reasons is that we read very differently than we hear. So when you're reading a book, it's not the same as somebody giving a speech. So when you start writing your talk, you're going to write it as though you're reading it. And it's going to read really well. But when you start speaking it, you'll notice all of these things that don't work quite right. So you sit down and you start editing. Make your sentences shorter, more concise, use simpler words and all of this, and then get up and rehearse. And when you do that 30, 40, 50 times, some people roll their eyes and go, oh my God, I can't believe I'm going to do it that many times. It's like you really start to feel it. You start to get that happy birthday effect.
I love that happy birthday effect. I think that is so clever. Well, one of the mistakes that I see a lot of people making is pushing out a bunch of information. And I want to talk about that, what's causing that. So I'm going to show, and versus just tell. We talk about that all the time. So, this concept of, we just have to get people to know, like, and trust us. And then people say, oh, well, what does that look like? And the problem with know, like, and trust is you think, well, if I have to get people to know me before they want to trust me, that's going to cause me to push out a bunch of information. You get confused about it. You think, oh, I've got to explain to everybody why they would need to know me and why they need to like me, and on and on and on. And when that happens, people get bored and they checked out because nobody remembers a bunch of information. And that's where storytelling comes in. So we're going to try this sharing of the screen again. So the old way of doing this is you got to know, like, and trust. So therefore, I got to give you a bunch of information, and then maybe you'll like me, and then maybe you'll trust me. And I tell people, you've got the order wrong. You need to start with trust. And that's a gut thing. In fact, the handshake came about to show you didn't have a weapon in your hand. And then it goes from the gut to the heart. The more you show empathy for someone and can describe what their pain point is, especially as you were describing a mistake you might have made when you share that in a TEDx talk or any kind of a situation, then people feel like, oh, I have empathy for what that felt like. You know what, I've been in that situation. And then it goes to our head where we want to have a story that gives people some kind of actionable takeaway where they think to themselves, you know what, this takeaway, this advice you're giving me would work for me. So tell me about some of the best TEDx talks you've seen and coached people giving that use this formula.
So I go all the way back to, the ancient Greeks and the Romans, which is where rhetoric started. And Aristotle had three principles that kind of mirror what you just talked about. And those are ethos, pathos, and logos. And ethos is where we get the word ethics. And it's really your credibility. Whether somebody believes in you, whether they trust you, whether they feel confident that you know what you're talking about. Pathos is the emotional side, which is kind of like liking somebody. You want to touch somebody emotionally. And I love the fact that you reverse the order on these, because it's really the third one, the intellect. Logos is where we get logic from. So your argument needs to come off as being logical. But that logic comes after the emotional connection and after that kind of credibility. So that gut, heart, and head is really important there. And one of the ways that you do that is really by being authentic on stage. Not just dumping out a bunch of information, because then you sound like a college professor. I'm reading from a textbook and here's all the information and I'm trying to convince you that this information is true. People need to be able to connect to you as a human first. And so one of the ways to do that is to put a human story within your story. Even if your story is very technical, let's bring in that human element.
Yes, I love that.
So for example, we did a TEDx at the Salk Institute a couple of years back. And one of the speakers, I coached all the speakers, and one of the professors there, one of the scientists, I should say, his specialty was electron microscopy.
Well, that's pretty complex, isn't it?
Beautiful technology, but he would get down to the molecular level of what they're seeing, and they're watching, cells split and divide and all this stuff. And I said, hey, I love all of that, but let's take a step back and tell me who you are. How did you get into this?
There we go.
And I was certain he was going to tell me that, oh, I knew I wanted to be a scientist when I was 5 years old, and I had a microscope, and I would, look through a telescope and all this kind of stuff. He said, when I was growing up, I wanted to be a tennis pro. And I said, unbelievable. He goes, but I realized I wasn't good enough. Decided to go to college. I said, oh, college, so there you wanted to be a scientist. He said, no, I was a philosophy major. And it turned out his girlfriend had told him, he needed to take an elective. And she said, why don't you take one of these organic chemistry classes? And he stumbled into this class and he got in the lab and he just says, this is it, I'm hooked. It completely changed his life. So I said, we need to put a piece of that in your talk.
Yes.
So that people can understand you took a human journey to get to the point where you became a scientist. Yes. You weren't born a scientist. You weren't running around in your diapers with a little stethoscope or something.
Right.
And so he ended up giving a really great talk that connected with the audience, because the audience, almost everybody's had this issue of what's my career, and am I going to change careers? What am I going to be when I grow up?
Yeah.
So he tapped into that, what am I going to be when I grow up, and then took him into the information piece.
I love that. Well, when I work with people in the business world, salespeople, or just helping people with their own story for an interview to get a job, I talk about the 4 parts of a story, and you just exhibited them brilliantly. So I can refer back to what you just said. So the first part is the exposition, the who, what, where, when, and then you describe a problem, and then there's a solution, and then there's the resolution. So Harry posted a question about how do we approach a very complex story and reduce it to 18 minutes for a TEDx talk. And the same is true whether you're given an hour in front of a client, if you're a salesperson. And many times in my career, they said, I know we said you have an hour, you only have 20 minutes. Right? So you have to be agile and flexible. But this concept, so if we look at what you just described for us, the Salk Institute, okay, that's Jonas Salk, who created, the polio vaccine. And so that you're doing a whole TEDx, we know that's going to be complicated and scientific. And then you tell the story of all the problem was this scientist was getting into the real nitty gritty and there was no emotional connection to what he was saying. And the solution you came up with was an unexpected story. It was not a linear story. And suddenly we know about his life just by chance, discovering how much he loved science and had a knack for it. And then that becomes a huge resolution to the story of whether you're thinking you might just stumble upon something, just like scientists do when they discover a cure, when they're not even trying to cure something. We know this, many examples of that, right? Penicillin was, even Viagra, many things were not originally discovered that way. So now, something that's very complex about molecules and scientists, we've taken them on that journey using exposition, a problem, a solution. And then I really feel that the secret sauce to a great story is the resolution. I talk about, The Wizard of Oz. Part of what really hooks that movie is that little 3-minute, 4-minute, when Dorothy's back home and saying, you were there and you were there. And suddenly she puts all the pieces together of what life is all about. If the movie ended with her in the hot air balloon going back home and be like, okay, but we need those takeaways, don't we?
Exactly. And in fact, in the story that I just told about that speaker, once he connected with the audience and he got into the technology of electron microscopy and how they're able to watch the AIDS virus and how it infiltrates a cell and how it replicates and all of this, then he came out of that and he basically said, what we're learning today will be able to use to investigate many other diseases. And I've been thinking about him lately because of COVID-19 and the fact that his research is exactly the kind of research that looks at that molecular level to say, how is the virus acting? Is it mutating? Is it changing? How is it affecting humans? Why is it killing one person and the other person doesn't even know they have it?
Wow.
And so he brought it back to that human level so that to the audience, he was saying, even though what I work on is very technical, the reason I do this is because it will change your life. The kinds of scientific discoveries that we're going to make will change the world of, disease prevention and control. So the people walked out of that talk feeling like, wow, my life is going to be different, and especially my children's lives are going to be different because of what he's doing.
Yes.
So it came right back to that human aspect.
Well, let's give everybody another example of storytelling. I was recently hired by Olympus Medical to be their keynote speaker for their 250 salespeople that call on doctors. And they really wanted to bring storytelling into their culture, tapping into another TED speaker, Simon Sinek, who's all about the why and not the how or the what. And if you haven't watched that, I highly encourage you to do so. You'll be joining millions and millions of people. But the thing is, that was an aha moment for their executive marketing director. This started the journey where they said, everything we're putting out in our marketing materials and what's coming out of the salespeople's mouth is about the what and the how, not why we're doing this. Let's find a speaker who can talk about storytelling and selling and help us get to our why. So they started their own journey of looking and used Google search, and my Better Selling Through Storytelling book came up. They saw I was a speaker, and then I was up against another speaker. So what's ironic about all this is I help people use storytelling to sell their product or service better, and yet people forget in the audience that I had to sell myself using the exact same skills. So I talked to them about what does it look like now, and how does it, what would this be? And I tell a story of how I helped an architecture firm win $1 billion airport renovation by telling a story that took people on a journey as opposed to just showing a bunch of before and after pictures with statistics. And when I started to work with the Olympus Medical people, I said to them, what are you saying now? Well, our equipment makes the surgeries 30% faster. And I said, okay, that's a nice feature. There's no story there. And there's certainly no emotional connection. It's very left brain analytical. You know, they start doing the math for how many more surgeries and how much money you could make or whatever. So I said, what does that really mean? How long is a typical surgery without your equipment? 2.5 hours. And with it, 30% faster, an hour and a half. I said, how about if we tell this story to a doctor? Tell the story of another doctor. And here's the secret, everybody. When people see themselves in your story, they want to go on that journey with you. So they said, you know, Dr. Higgins was using our equipment compared to what he had been using. And you can imagine how happy he was that he was able to go out into the waiting room and tell the patient's family, who was waiting to know if their loved one was okay or not, as they looked for cancer, made it and got good results an hour and a half earlier, an hour earlier than normal, because for that family in the waiting room, if you've ever been there, every minute feels like an hour. And so the doctor said, this is why I became a doctor, because I wanted to be able to deliver good news. And the fact that I could deliver good news and heal people earlier than making someone out there waiting. And they said, oh my God, that gives us chills. We've never thought about the patient's family benefiting from this. And so let's talk about characters in a story that we bring in, and how do we tug at people's heartstrings so inevitably they want to, you know, open their purse strings and buy from us. What do you think about the importance of describing characters like that?
I think it's key. And I had a wonderful opportunity a couple of years ago to work with an entrepreneur who was starting a brand new company. And they were still in stealth mode. So nobody knew they existed. Their product hadn't been released yet. And I came in and I said, well, this is odd. I mean, I work with entrepreneurs and CEOs, but they have existing businesses. And he said, you know, I want all of my employees to become storytellers. And I want them to start thinking about stories and what they do. So we brainstormed a couple of options, you know, and one was I gave a workshop to everyone just kind of on the general principles of storytelling. But then we had a very unique idea that we got everyone to buy into. And that was we were going to make a commercial for a product that didn't exist yet. So we storyboarded the process, and we basically said, this is not you as an engineer or a marketing person telling the world how great your product is. We're going to focus this little movie on two people. The one person who's bringing out this product, and the other person is going to be one of the customers. So tell us a story of who this person is who's developing this product.
Yes.
And once that product gets in the market and a customer gets a hold of that product, what are they going to do with it? And of course, the focus was that the customer's life was going to be better, or to your point, they were going to be happier. Because every successful product ends up with a happy customer.
Yes.
You know, they have a smile on their face. They're satisfied. Maybe it solved a pain point. Maybe it reduced the amount of time. Maybe it relieves stress, whatever it is. So we actually did a storyboard. A couple of the employees in the company were pretty good with cameras. And a couple of the engineers had daughters who had been in theater. So we actually wrote this out, and they filmed a little movie of these two people. And it humanized the whole process of why their product existed in the first place, and the change that happened to their customer. And when they showed this little video to the rest of the company, everyone's eyes just got really big. Like they were watching someone's life change in front of them. And for most businesses, you don't get to see that.
No.
You make the sales call, you win the order, you ship the product, and then that company might sell that again to somebody else. You know, you don't get to be in that waiting room to touch on your story, and you don't get to see the look on the family's face when they go, oh my God, thank you so much. We were sitting here worrying minute by minute. It's so good to hear this news sooner rather than later. And so by doing that, they were able to visually show that customer being happy. And I would encourage other people to do something like that, to really envision how the customer is going to feel
Yes.
when your product has an effect on them.
Because here's a big myth, kind of like the myth of I'd rather die than get up and speak. Another myth is people buy logically. There's no emotion in any decisions. And newsflash, people buy emotionally and then back it up with logic. And a lot of my tech engineer audiences and clients are shocked by that because they think everything they're doing is logic. And I said, listen, I promise if you go into a really expensive sports car dealership, they're not talking about how many miles per gallon it gets. They're talking about how sexy you're going to look and feel and how much fun it's going to be. So that's the part of the joy of storytelling is it elicits an emotion and then drives us going from there. You know, this concept of storytelling, I want to go back to that for a second and with another story and an example of that. So this premise that, do we have a story or not? I think everybody has a story. And as we've talked about, you can tap into your stories from looking at your mistakes that you've made or lessons that you've learned. And businesses tend to talk about things through a case study, which has been around forever. It's very boring. They usually go, well, you know, we worked with this client and, you know, they blah, blah, blah. And you're just listening to someone recite, as you said, a bunch of information. So the magic is when you turn a boring case study into a compelling case story, then almost like the Wizard of Oz, it goes from black and white to color. People are suddenly pulled in saying, oh, I want to go on that journey. And when I was working with that architecture firm, we turned that fairly traditional, boring case study. And I said, okay, what's the exposition? Well, 2 years ago, JetBlue hired us at JFK to renovate the airport. And one of the problems we had to deal with was ripping up all the floors in the middle of the night. And we had all our vendors on call from 9 o'clock at night till 9 in the morning in case something went wrong. And sure enough, at 2 in the morning, a fuse blew. And we had the vendor there in 20 minutes, fixed it. And at 8:59, the last tile went down. And then all the stores opened on time at 9 a.m. And now a year later, sales are up 15% because we've designed a place that attracts and keeps people shopping longer. Well, that's a case story as opposed to just a lot of before and after pictures. And again, instead of getting up there and saying, we use critical thinking to anticipate problems, that was part of the story. We had all our vendors on call. And even just the little visual of at 8:59, the last tile went down, a little bit of drama in a story is very important. So would you speak to that of how that, good TED Talks, good TEDx Talks use this?
Yeah, I love that visual that you just mentioned of, putting down that last tile. We are so geared these days to the Hollywood version of that kind of storytelling, where it's right down to the last second and the hero just has no chance of winning.
Yep.
And of course, he pulls it off in this miraculous fashion. And we feel good because the hero was successful. There's that emotional connection between the success of the hero and our desire to be successful also.
Yes.
And back to your early point about the emotions versus the logic, it's so true. There's a lot of studies that have been done where people say, oh no, I make my decisions very logically, it's based on the facts. And studies have shown that emotion always leads, but once we are emotionally attached, there needs to be the logic underneath. Because without the logic underneath, it's just a feel-good story, and there's no kind of takeaway from that. So I think that's important for people to remember that they do need the data, but it needs to support the emotional piece of the story. And when we're working with TEDx speakers, that's much the same process. They start off with, here's all of the data that I want to put out there. And then we come back and say, okay, how can they connect to you? And then how can your data connect to the audience? like in the case of that scientist,
Mm-hmm.
what he was doing was very technical, but the result of what he was doing was going to touch people's lives.
Mm.
We had a young woman on our stage a while back that she was talking about the integration of San Diego and Tijuana, Mexico, and the fact that these two cities sit on the most heavily trafficked land border in the world. And yet people think it's so far away and it's a foreign country. But when you bring people together, you see how cultures interact. So instead of this becoming kind of a political issue or a physical issue or even some sort of immigration issue, all of a sudden she brought him down to culture.
Hmm.
It was like, think of the music that we share across this border. Think of the art that we share. She even told a really funny story, inside of her big story, which was, hey, when your friends come to town, they all want to know, where can I get the $2 tacos?
Yes.
The Taco Tuesday had become kind of this religion in the United States. And so she brought this laughter into the audience where everyone in the audience could connect because they all knew what Taco Tuesday was.
Right.
Maybe they didn't know about commerce across the border. Maybe they didn't understand all of the ramifications of two cultures, but it brought it down to this very common point. And I think when you can do that, then you can layer the statistics on that. And people now trust you because you've met them where they are. You've put yourself in the audience's shoes.
Harry has another question for us, and it sort of taps into what you were saying earlier about how Hollywood has influenced our perception of what a good story is and how we get pulled in. And Robert McGee is known for being a big teacher of script writing. And then, of course, there's Joseph Campbell, who's also known as, creating the story structure of the hero's journey. And I've got some examples of how both of those things intersect the hero's journey within movies. But before I jump into my answer to that question, I'd like to just hear, do you pull from both when you're working with people on their TEDx talks and companies?
Yeah, I like to pull from a variety of sources.
Mm-hmm.
And I love to go back in history, so I can bring some of Aristotle and Cicero into the mix to say, look how old storytelling is.
Yes.
Before any of this electronics came out, the only way we could convey a message was through verbally, speaking in front of a crowd. Mm-hmm. And then get into the Hollywood genre, which the hero's journey is a big part of that.
Yes.
Some people like to talk about the 3-act play in the theater. So there's some elements you can pull out of that. There's a whole area of expertise called narrative nonfiction. And this is where you take nonfiction, but instead of presenting it like a newspaper report, you present it as a story. And so if you've ever seen movies like The Right Stuff or Black Hawk Down, true stories, but they were wrapped in a narrative. And so you can kind of pull techniques from each of these different genres to really convince people that on stage, you can be telling a true story, but do it in a narrative fashion. I think you mentioned this earlier, where you have characters and you have emotions and you have plot points and you have a resolution.
Nice.
So these basic principles can all be pulled together.
So let's share with people some genres of storytelling, and then we're going to talk about a movie that uses it and a brand that uses it. So this, rags to riches is a very common example of storytelling. And of course, the movie that uses it is Cinderella. And she gets completely transformed into something amazing. Now, we hear rags to riches stories when we hear about Oprah. She was born very poor, and then the fact that she's a billionaire. Brands use it. Like Johnny Walker Scotch used to be this poor Scottish farmer. Now he's Johnny Walker. When I was giving a talk at the Coca-Cola Summit for their CMOs, I met the marketing director at Aunt Anne's Pretzels, which are sold in airports and shopping centers. And I said, how did this all start? Oh, she started selling one pretzel at a farmer's market. Clearly scaled up from there. The next one is a quest, right? Going on this journey. And for me, nothing says that better than Lord of the Rings. And Lord of the Rings is all about finding that ring. I must get that back. Lexus, their tagline used to be the pursuit of perfection. We're on this journey together. And how do we get there? And then the next one is a rebirth genre. And this, of course, is It's a Wonderful Life. When he's trying to figure out how I can get a second chance at my life. And Prudential uses this in their marketing. They says, your retirement is your third act. They literally talk about it in terms of storytelling structure, Mark. It's your third act. It's not just a continuation of middle age. It is a rebirth. So it's very obvious. And then, of course, back to our favorite, your decision, do I stay home or travel, which takes on all kinds of meaning now during the COVID-19 situation. But from a storytelling standpoint, that, of course, is The Wizard of Oz. And, we talked about this importance of this resolution. So this is all part of the storytelling. And of course, now when people are going to go back to traveling again, Expedia uses this genre when they say, go book a trip on Expedia, have this amazing adventure, and then come back and tell all your friends about it. So it's so important that people are taken on a journey so that they can relate to it. One of the biggest problems I help companies and salespeople do is become memorable. When I was talking to an executive search firm, he said, it's between us and two other people typically, and we each get an hour to come in and present. And we always say, hey, can we go last? Because we've done some research hoping that whoever goes last is more memorable. And I said, ooh, if that's what you're depending on to be memorable, you're in trouble. So can you speak to the power of how stories make us more memorable?
Yeah, I did a webinar recently with a bunch of hosts from Airbnb. And these were their experience hosts. Mm-hmm. And of course, they're used to people coming into town, right, and having these great experiences. And right now there's no travel. So they're looking at, okay, once travel opens up, how am I going to retool myself? How am I going to improve my company? And I said, people, when they're in storytelling mode, it happens in 3 phases. And this happens in a lot of industries, but travel's kind of the top example for me. Mm-hmm. I said the first storytelling that they get into is when they see your product. They start telling themselves a story of, when I'm having that experience, what is it going to be like? I'm going to be walking through a city, I'm going to be surfing, I'm going to be tasting wine, whatever it is. And they have to have a good enough story in their head for them to hit the buy button and to even purchase your product in the first place. Mm-hmm. And then the second level of storytelling is when they actually do go on vacation, they're in your city, and you're actually taking them on a hike out through, the mountain ranges. Now they're in a real-time story. It's no longer imagination. It's like every step is a little piece of the story, the other people who are on the tour, all of the things that they see. And then the third part of the story is once they go home. And that's when they're telling all of their friends. Yes. And so that's where that memory really becomes solidified, because they started out envisioning the process and then they actually experienced it. Now they're telling their friends. And I think Apple did this really well. To give one quick example here, I remember these giant billboards when the iPod came out, and it would have, this girl dancing with headphones and she's holding an iPod. And there's like, that's it. There's no text, there's no specs, there's like nothing there. But the whole story was people driving by that billboard going, I could be that person. If I was that person and I had that product, I could be listening to music everywhere. And so then they go out and they buy the product. Right. And now they're at the beach, they're running on the beach and they're listening to their favorite music. Mm-hmm. And then the third part of that story is they go tell all their friends, you can't believe how great this product is. Mm-hmm. It's changed my life completely. Now I can listen to my favorite music everywhere that I'm at.
Once you get someone to become your brand ambassador and tell your story, they have so much more impact than you telling your own story. Right. And when you're trying to get a client to hire you as a speaker like I do, or to get a client to buy your product versus another product for a hospital or whatever it is you're selling, you need to have somebody inside who can remember your story. They're not going to remember 30% faster necessarily, but they're going to remember that story. And because there's a lot of decision makers nowadays. And so you need someone who can remember your story and tell it for you. And that's why I've created an online course called Better Selling Through Storytelling to help people learn how to become better storytellers so that they are able to start increasing the amount of sales that they're closing, because they just keep going up to bat and going, oh, I'm not getting anything, and they get burned out. I know I was there. I was on that roller coaster of just pushing and pushing and pushing, hoping something stuck on the wall like spaghetti. And now with storytelling, you don't have to push so hard. You can pull people in. And one of my clients said, we are just so tired of coming in second place when we go up for these, presentations. And they go, well, we looked at 3 and sorry, you came in second. And unlike the Olympics, there's no reward. There's no medal for second place in business. You just don't get the business. So when I started working with them and they sent their team through this course to learn how to turn these boring case studies into case stories, they won 3 new pieces of business back to back. So they were just ecstatically happy. And, of course, when I was working with Gensler, the architecture firm, on renovating the Pittsburgh airport, the stakes, we know, Mark, are so important in a story, right? You have to have, for people to care. I've never worked on anything that had the stakes that high. $1 billion was at stake on who told the best story during that interview hour. And so this concept of nobody wants to be pushy. And a lot of people hate even saying that they're salespeople because the image of an old used car salesman, pushing stuff. And Kurt Beecher, who's the CEO of Sugar Mountain Foods, they make this amazing cheese up in Seattle, had said, hey, can you come teach my team how to become persuasive but not pushy? And how would you do that? And I said, teaching them how to tell stories. Because when you teach people stories, they're in the story. You're not pushing, you're pulling people in. And we just touched on the importance of, people forget what you say right after you leave the room. And that's why going last was hopefully, a hope strategy, which is not at all something you can control, but you can control telling the best story. So even if you have to go first, you set the bar and people will remember you and then share that story. And this one, I love this phrase, and I hear it a lot in the healthcare industry. People say, oh God, I'm trying to talk to the doctors in between surgeries. I literally feel like I'm an annoying pest. And I said, well, stop pushing out a bunch of information and tell them a quick story. And the story doesn't have to be necessarily something about your product. Just, oh, you look really overwhelmed. You remind me of another doctor who was so overwhelmed he didn't have time to go to the bathroom to get his lunch. And I brought him his lunch next time. Would you like me to do that for you? Boom. It's amazing. I can't wait to see you again, Anne. Do you have any more stories for me? There's always time for a good story, not for being bored by a bunch of information. And then people talk about, is there anything telling can do to help me, become better? I feel invisible. My calls didn't get returned. People go, who are you? What's the company again? And I said, you got to start with a story just to get on somebody's radar. And so have a really catchy line in your subject line in your email. And I help people do all of this. So they go from invisible to feeling irresistible. And then you get people wanting to work with you. You're not pushing anymore. You're pulling them in. So this online course goes through everything we just talked about here, but in much greater detail. You can do it at your own pace. It's only like 10-minute modules. There's a little quiz to make sure you understood things. You don't even have to do it in order. I've made it so it's not cumulative. Rob Angel, the creator of Pictionary, said, I skipped around on the things I wanted to learn first. I said, great, it's designed for you to do that. And he was able to use what he learned in this to help him tell better stories for his talks, as well as when he's getting interviewed for his new book. So, if I've put together a lot of bonuses, and for everybody on this particular mastermind, not only do you get invited to a Facebook group where you can work with me once a week with everyone else who's in the course and actually have me help you with your pitch, but I'm giving people a 1 hour bonus to work with me one-on-one. That normally goes for $500 an hour. So you can see the value of signing up now will give you an hour after you've gone through the course for me to help you do this. And you know, if you're selling something for $50,000 like the Olympus Medical people do, and you're closing, 5 out of 10 pitches, and through becoming a better storyteller, you close 6 out of 10, well, that's obviously a great benefit to you. And so the course investment is only $497, and I come up with a 60-day guarantee. If your sales aren't up by 10% after taking the course, I just give you your money back. Why? Because I don't want people to feel like this is a risk. And I'm so passionate, and my purpose is to help as many people as possible become storytellers, because I know it can help change the way you feel about yourself and the impact you have on people. So again, if you go to this website, johnlivesay.com/sales, you can sign up and you'll get the bonus hour to work with me one-on-one. The Olympus Medical people put their entire team of people through it after my keynote so that they kept reinforcing what they've heard. And you're in a similar situation where you've heard a mini version of my keynote, and the course will just reinforce this. And you can imagine how much better your life is going to be where there's storytelling in your toolbox instead of a hammer, as Maslow said, looking for something to hit a nail. So I want to open it up now for any questions. Marion, thanks. You love that. There's always time for a good story. And you talk yourself out of it saying, oh, no one has time to listen to my story. But if you're going to learn how to be clear, concise, and compelling with your stories, people always have time for that. Don't you find, Mark?
Absolutely. And I think the key thing to remember there, and you'll hear this about storytelling all the time, is to really know your audience. Because every audience is going to be different, and every audience has a very unique perspective on the experiences that they've been in. Even if you sell one product to 100 different clients, all 100 of those clients are going to have their own story.
Right.
But you really do need to do your homework, put yourself in their shoes, and really understand, what does success mean to them? Success to you means I made the sale. Nothing wrong with that. But if you're really focused on what is success for them, what does that story look like? Then your story can be more tailored to take them on a journey in their own mind from where they are today to a place where they're successful. Earlier on, we talked about customers being happy. It's that same thing. They want to feel like this was a good choice. This was the wise move. And this made my life better. It made my company better, made my customers better.
Nice. Harry was thanking us. Great information. And I want to thank you, Mark, for giving us your wisdom and your insights and all that experience putting on so many TEDx talks. And now you're helping people around the world. So if anybody's interested in learning how to give a TEDx talk, I've referred several of my friends to you and everyone, and you coached me on mine. I will forever be grateful for that incredible experience. Storytelling is it, gang, and that's why I wanted to invite Mark on, because we're both in that same mindset of whoever tells the best story has the best TEDx talk or the best chance at their career. Caroline says, thanks, great conversation. Thank you all for joining us, and look forward to getting to work with you, hopefully on telling your story. And someone's asking how people can get a hold of you, Mark.
If you go to storytellingwithimpact.com, that has all my information. You can connect to me through there. Like John, I also have an offer on my website for people who want to just get on a Zoom call with me. My rates are similar normally, but in this time of COVID, I've been giving people a free hour session with me. It's been amazing. I've heard a lot of great stories, not just about business, but mainly about what people are experiencing going through quarantine. So you can book a time with me if you want, and we can chat too.
Wow. Bonus for people joining this webinar. You get an hour bonus with me if you sign up for the course now, And Mark's been generous enough to throw in an hour of his time. And I can tell you, you will really get a lot out of it. I have myself. All right. Thanks again, everybody. Go out and tell great stories.